This is the World Organic News, the week ending 26th of November 2018. John Moore reporting. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. Now, as promised, or perhaps threatened last week, I'm going on to an explanation of evolution in regard to gardening, farming and regenerative methods. Why am I qualified to do this? I'm so glad you asked. My academic qualifications are in human origins and Australian prehistory. Evolution is the underpinning of the discipline. Understanding it is essential to understanding what happened in the past, is still happening now, and, for this exercise, will continue in the future. I'll begin with the errors in evolution, or more particularly the errors in evolutionary explanation. I hear even qualified people say things like, the native wildlife is adapting to the threat of cane toads by getting smaller. So there are a few things here. The cane toad is an introduced species in Australia. They are poisonous to anything that attempts to eat them. They've devastated native populations of snakes and large lizards wherever they are. And they've been spreading west across the top of Australia from Queensland. The problem with the statement above is that animals are not growing smaller in reaction to the arrival of cane toads in their environment. Evolution doesn't work that way. A species does not decide to change in response to a change in their environment. What happens is this. The environment changes. The species within the environment are affected by the change. Some of the species are still able to grow to sexual maturity and reproduce, and others do not. Why? Because every time there is a new generation, some variation in the genome occurs. Most of the variation is benign, but some of it is not. Think of six-legged calves in this situation that pop up from time to time. So these variations accumulate, and when the environment changes, those with the variations that assist with reproduction in the new environment survive. The others do not. So to reiterate, a population of individuals within a species go about their business of eating, sleeping and reproducing. A change occurs and some members are able to reproduce and others not. Those that do pass on their particular part of the gene pool. In the case of the native animals and the cane toads, what actually occurred was that the larger animals who could get a cane toad into their mouths died before they could reproduce. Those whose genes expressed themselves as smaller mouthed versions of the species were therefore not exposed to the cane toad poison. And they didn't die, and their variations were passed on to the next generation. Now, some of those that reproduced continued to grow and died from cane toad poison later, but their early reproductive genes were passed on. Over time, the population became essentially composed of those who either had small mouths all their lives were able to reproduce before they suffered the poisoning. This leads to a different population profile. Oh look, the species has reacted to the cane toad threat by getting smaller mouths. No. Those with smaller mouths were better suited to, or in the parlance of the discipline, were fit to reproduce. But I hear you ask, how has this got anything to do with cabbage growing? And a fair question. Let's look back at some high school biology and the wonderful Gregor Mendel. There's a link about Gregor in the show notes. Now, I'm not sure if people remember this Augustinian friar, but he stuck in my mind. He did the experiments on the colours of pea flowers and their passing on from generation to generation. He discovered the dominant and recessive genes in these pea flowers and by extension any species that reproduces sexually. By crossbreeding pea plants, he established that a recessive gene will only express itself, in the case of his experiments, they were pea flower colour, on average 1 in 4 times during reproduction. This is because 2 recessives are needed for the gene to be expressed, and if a dominant and a recessive are passed on to the next generation, only the dominant is expressed. And of course 2 dominants together will of course produce a dominant variant. Follow the link in the show notes for more on this. So we have dominant and recessive genes in all species that reproduce sexually. This includes nearly all vegetable crops, except for those we propagate via cuttings or layering, etc. That's called cloning, and is a variation of asexual reproduction, as is the division of single-cell organisms. There are many genes that express themselves in this dominant recessive way. Blue eyes in humans, hair and fleece colours in sheep. Let's leave Damara sheep to one side, for they are a complicated case, even though the theory holds good for them. Establishing dominant recessive genes in dammers is as complicated as working out Senate preferences in the Australian Federal Parliament, and not for the faint-hearted. So we have species with variations contained in their genomes. These genes express themselves in a variety of ways depending on the environment in which they grow. Blackberries go berserk in Australia and parts of the US, yet in Ireland they are considered a normal part of hedgerow ecology. The different environments lead to different expressions of the same genes, of the same species. We then toss into the mix selected hybrid varieties or cultivars. These are chosen for specific characteristics, usually based upon a given set of environmental conditions. So some need to be protected from 100% of weed competition. Others are rust resistant in the case of cereals. If we toss into this mix GM varieties that survive the use of, say, glyphosate, then to fully express their genetic potential, they will need to be sprayed with glyphosate to give them an advantage over the weed species. These cultivars are so specialised that their offspring will not throw true to type in the second generation on farm. This destroys the predictability built into the hybridised and GM cultivars, which means, of course, seed must be purchased each year. Traditional seed varieties are known as open pollinated type. They reproduce each year through sexual selection in our gardens, fields and paddocks. They differ from the hybrid varieties in that they tend to have a greater genetic variation in any population size than the hybrids. They still produce seeds that can be used the next year and will throw true to type. This means they tend to have a longer harvest period, different returns in different parts of the paddock, and greater resilience to variations in seasons. Of course, in a drought nothing will grow, but no matter how wide their genetic variation. The advantages of the hybrid seeds are returns and consistency in a given environment, usually one supported by artificial fertilisers and chemical herbicides. But the consistency of seasons, always a bit dicey anyway, especially in the southern hemisphere and increasingly in the northern, means more inputs are needed or returns are lower. Either way, monetary returns are falling. The non-hybrid types, the open pollinated cultivars, and I should point out I've been talking about plants for the last little while, I'll come to stock soon. The open pollinated types do not as a rule require as much fertiliser, and with companion planting and other techniques, no chemical herbicides nor pesticides. This is because the wider variation in the gene type tends to throw up plants better able to survive attack than others. We know from previous episodes that this is predicated upon healthy soils and fungal communities, and especially no-dig techniques, but the case still holds. So back to the cabbages. As the climate variability and warming trend continues, we need as much variation in gene pools as possible to ensure some returns in conditions over which we have no control. We should, I would argue, be planting more than one crop per paddock. We need to build into our production systems as much resilience through genetic variability as possible. That way, the changing environmental conditions will not destroy the returns per growing area to the same extent as betting, and I will use that word deliberately, as betting on a narrowly focused hybrid species that would need to be coddled through conditions not breeding to its specifications. Now, when it comes to perennials, the matter becomes a little more complicated. Once in the ground, they are difficult to change. My thinking is to plant not just a variety of species, but a variety within species. So early, mid-early, late early, and so on all the way up to late varieties, which would give 9 variations and variations within each of those sections. This will ensure some fruit, even if a late frost or wet spell at flowering, would cause problems for an orchard planted to one cultivar. Variation is what we are looking for to mimic nature as much as possible. As to stock, hybridisation has occurred in poultry and pigs as well. A lot less so in ruminants, but there has still been a narrowing of the gene pool there too. Smallholders should, for the same reasons as using pollinated seeds, use the more traditional breeds of poultry and pigs, if they are still available. We have suffered a huge loss in breeds over the last 100-odd years as we, in inverted commas, knew what we were doing. The older species were usually better suited to outdoor living, have better flavour and, to be fair, take longer to reach slaughter weights, but again do not require specialised growing conditions. A more dispersed population of older chicken breeds, for instance, spread across a number of small holdings is better, I would argue, for the chooks, the people eating the eggs, and above all, the animals themselves. for outdoor stock are also better suited to regenerative farming techniques. The older breeds of sheep and cattle too fall into this argument. I've kept Shropshires in the past. They have put on fat just by looking at a paddock. When we went into drought, they continued to put on condition, breed and lamb, all without supplemental feed and eating what appeared to be nothing but dead grass. The meat had real flavour, but too much fat for, in inverted commas, modern tastes. I trimmed it at the cooking time, and that became part of the cat's feed. Don't waste anything. We need to capture as much variety as possible in our growing systems. Variety equals resilience, and we need resilience now. We really need resilience now. We are in a race to avoid a calamity and a future where human life is fed on insects and algae, and I say that without exaggeration. The great diversity of agricultural cultivars has been pruned to the bone during the last century, so it's up to us to save what is left, as it may just be what saves us. And on that note, I'll draw this episode to a conclusion. Remember, decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. So with all of the above in mind and the fact that we're living in the 21st century, I'm going to open up application for a regenerative agriculture mastermind group. It'll be limited to 12 people. We'll meet weekly online to discuss our successes, challenges and decisions. The wisdom of the crowd applied to this necessary field of endeavour. You can have a look at the intro page and click through to the application at worldorganicnews.com/mastermind application. There's a link in the show notes. And of course the podcasting checklists are still available over at mrjohnmoore.com. A transcript of this episode is available at worldorganicnews.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll be back next week.